Sir, pieces in this case start at $50,000, so unless you're ready to spend, I suggest you step back. The sentence didn't echo loudly, but it didn't need to. It sliced through the polished quiet of the showroom like a blade drawn slow and deliberate, and for a brief second, even the soft instrumental jazz playing overhead seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself was listening. Malcolm Hayes didn't move. He stood there in front of the glass display, hands resting loosely at his sides, his reflection caught between rows of diamonds arranged with surgical precision under warm white lighting. The store sat on the corner of 5th Avenue and East 57th Street, Manhattan, prime real estate, where every square foot whispered wealth, and every customer was expected to look the part before they even spoke a word. Malcolm didn't. He wore a plain charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. No watch, no ring, no visible signal that he belonged anywhere near a place where a single necklace could cost more than a house in most parts of the country. And yet, his eyes didn't wander like someone out of place. They studied, calculated, absorbed. He tilted his head slightly, examining a cushion-cut diamond set in platinum, the kind of piece that didn't just sparkle, it commanded attention. The man who had spoken, Ryan Caldwell, the store manager, stood a few feet behind the counter with his arms folded, posture stiff with a confidence that came not from certainty, but from assumption. He had seen hundreds of customers walk through those doors. He believed he knew the type within seconds. Malcolm didn't match any of them. Not the high-net-worth regulars. Not the corporate clients. Not the couples celebrating anniversaries. And so Ryan had already made his decision before Malcolm ever said a word. Malcolm's gaze remained fixed on the ring as if Ryan hadn't spoken at all, but the air between them tightened, subtle and charged. A few feet away, a young associate named Lily Tran stood frozen behind another display case, her fingers hovering over a tablet she hadn't realized she'd stopped tapping. She had noticed Malcolm the moment he walked in, not because of what he wore, but because of how he carried himself. Calm, unhurried, like someone who wasn't browsing, but observing, testing. She had also noticed how no one had greeted him. No good afternoon. No can I help you find something? Just silence, followed by that sentence. Ryan took a step closer now, his shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, the sound sharp in the otherwise controlled environment. I'm serious, he added, voice lower this time, but edged with something firmer, something that suggested authority rather than service. These items aren't for casual browsing. Malcolm finally shifted his gaze, not quickly, not reactively, but with a measured turn of his head that felt almost deliberate, like he had been expecting the moment. His eyes met Ryan's, steady and unreadable. There was no anger there, no embarrassment, just a quiet focus that seemed to weigh the man in front of him without needing to say a word. For a second, Ryan faltered, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that he straightened his posture again, as if correcting himself. If you'd like, we have more affordable selections in the back, he continued, gesturing vaguely toward a section of the store that was clearly not where the featured pieces were displayed. That might be more appropriate. The word hung there, carefully chosen, but heavy with implication. Malcolm let the silence stretch. He didn't rush to respond. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. Instead, he glanced back at the ring, then at the glass case, then at the small digital panel beside it that displayed the item's details. 3.2 carats, internally flawless, platinum band, $187,500. The number didn't surprise him. He already knew it. That was the point. Behind him, a couple who had been browsing watches slowed their conversation, their voices dropping as they began to pay attention. Across the room, another associate pretended to adjust a display, but her eyes flicked over every few seconds. The atmosphere shifted, not loud, not chaotic, but tight, like something was building just beneath the surface. Malcolm's voice, when it finally came, was calm, almost conversational. I'd like to see that one, he said, nodding toward the ring. No raised tone, no challenge, just a simple request. Ryan didn't move. I don't think that's necessary, he replied quickly, the words coming faster than before, as if he wanted to shut the moment down before it could grow. We typically reserve that piece for serious buyers. Malcolm's expression didn't change. And what makes you think I'm not one? The question landed softly, but it carried weight. Not because of how it was said, but because of what it forced Ryan to confront. For a brief second, the manager hesitated, not in thought, but in presentation, his mind already made up, but now required to justify itself out loud. Experience, Ryan answered, his tone sharpening just slightly. You can usually tell. Malcolm nodded once, slow, acknowledging the answer without agreeing to it. Tell what? He asked. Ryan's jaw tightened. The room felt smaller now. Who's actually in a position to make a purchase like that? He said. The couple by the watches stopped pretending not to listen. Lily's grip tightened around her tablet. Malcolm looked at Ryan for a long second, then glanced around the showroom. The polished counters, the velvet-lined trays, the carefully arranged lighting that made every stone look like it held its own source of light. He had designed that layout, approved that lighting, signed off on every display case in that room. And still, he stood there being measured by someone who thought ownership had a uniform. He exhaled slowly. Not frustration, not defeat, just a release of something older, familiar. A memory flickered, uninvited but clear. Years ago, a different store, smaller, less refined, but with the same look in the eyes of the man behind the counter. We don't let people try those on unless we know they can afford them. Back then, Malcolm had walked out. Back then, he didn't have a choice. The present snapped back into place just as quickly. Malcolm's eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity. The kind that comes when a pattern repeats itself one time too many. Open the case, he said, his voice still even, but no longer soft. It wasn't louder. It was firmer, defined. Ryan shook his head almost immediately. That's not how this works, he replied, taking another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make it feel intentional. We don't just open high-value inventory for anyone who walks in off the street. Anyone. The word didn't slip. It landed. And this time, the room felt it. Lily's eyes flicked to the system on her tablet. Almost instinctively, her fingers moving without thinking as she pulled up the store's internal inventory log. She wasn't trying to prove anything yet. Just checking. Just making sure. Malcolm didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone else. His focus stayed on Ryan. Then, maybe, Malcolm said slowly, you should reconsider how you decide who's worth your time. Ryan let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. I think I've got a pretty good system, he replied. Malcolm nodded again. Yeah, he said quietly. I can see that. And for the first time since he walked in, Malcolm reached into his pocket. Not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate. As if the next move had already been decided long before this moment ever began. Malcolm's hand moved slowly inside his pocket. Not rushed, not defensive, but deliberate, as if whatever he was about to do had already been decided long before Ryan Caldwell opened his mouth. The showroom lights reflected faintly off the glass cases, catching the subtle shift in posture that only a few people in the room noticed, and Lily Tran was one of them. Her eyes flicking between Malcolm and the system screen in front of her as lines of data began to load. Inventory tags, internal access, levels, ownership markers that most associates never needed to look at. But something about the tension in the air made her check anyway. Ryan stood firm, arms crossed again, leaning slightly into his authority, as if proximity alone could reinforce the line he had already drawn. If you are looking for assistance, I can direct you to items within a more realistic range, he said, the words polished but pointed, carefully dressed in customer service language that barely concealed the judgment. Underneath, Malcolm didn't respond immediately, his fingers brushing against the edge of his phone as he pulled it out, not to show, not to prove, just to hold. And that small movement shifted the attention in the room even further, the couple near the watch display now fully turned, the other associate pausing mid-step, the music overhead continuing, but somehow feeling quieter. Malcolm glanced at the screen of his phone for a brief second, then lifted his eyes back to Ryan, steady, composed, almost patient. You keep talking about what I can afford, he said, his tone even, measured. But you have not once asked what I am here for. And that sentence landed differently, not sharp, not loud, but precise, like it had been placed exactly where it needed to be. Ryan let out a short breath through his nose, a restrained reaction that suggested irritation more than reflection. People who are here to buy do not need to be asked, he replied. They make it obvious. And again, the word people lingered, not accidental, Not unclear. Malcolm nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than agreement, then looked past Ryan for a split second, scanning the store, the layout, the employees. The way the system of behavior had already revealed itself without needing further explanation. Behind the counter, Lily's screen finished loading, and for a moment, she thought she had clicked the wrong profile, because the name staring back at her did not match the situation in front of her. Malcolm Hayes, ownership classification, executive-level access, full system authority. Her fingers froze above the tablet as her eyes widened just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to shift her breathing. She glanced up at Malcolm again, then back at the screen, then at Ryan, who still had no idea what was unfolding inches away from him. Malcolm's voice came again, calm, controlled. "Open the case," he repeated, not louder, but firmer, the kind of firmness that did not need volume to carry authority. Ryan shook his head, quicker this time, more certain, doubling down on the decision he had already made. "I already told you. That is not going to happen," he said. And there it was, not a suggestion, not a policy explanation, but a refusal, clear and final. The air tightened again, the kind of tension that does not explode but compresses, drawing everyone closer without movement. Lily swallowed, her eyes still locked on the screen, the weight of what she knew pressing against the instinct to stay quiet, to follow hierarchy, to avoid stepping out of line. But something about Malcolm's stillness made that harder than usual, because he did not look like someone waiting for permission. He looked like someone measuring consequences. Malcolm shifted his weight slightly, just enough to change the angle of the light across his face, his expression unchanged, but his presence now filling more of the space than before. "You are right," he said quietly, and for a brief second, Ryan's posture eased, as if he thought the situation was resolving, as if he believed compliance had finally arrived. "This is not how it works," Malcolm continued, and then he lifted his phone, not high, not dramatic, just enough to bring it into view, his thumb tapping once on the screen, precise, intentional, and somewhere beyond the walls of that showroom, something began to move. Ryan frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you doing?" he asked, the first hint of uncertainty entering his tone, small, but present. Malcolm did not answer the question directly. Instead, he looked at Ryan the same way he had from the beginning, steady, unshaken. "I am giving you a chance," he said, and that sentence did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a statement of fact, like something already in motion. Lily's heart started to beat faster, her eyes darting between Malcolm and the system, and then, almost instinctively, she took a step forward, her voice quiet but audible. "Ryan," she said, and the manager turned toward her, irritation already forming. "Not now, Lily," he snapped, dismissive, unwilling to break focus from the situation he thought he controlled. But Lily did not step back. This time, she held her ground, her voice steadier now. "You might want to check the system," she added, and for a second, the words hung there, uncertain, fragile, but real. Ryan's eyes narrowed, the suggestion itself challenging his authority more than the situation ever had. "I know the system," he replied sharply, "and I know who our clients are." And with that, he turned his attention back to Malcolm, doubling down once more. "Sir, I am going to ask you one last time to step away from that case," he said, the words now carrying the weight of escalation, not service, not suggestion, but enforcement. Malcolm did not move, not an inch, his gaze locked, his posture unchanged. But something in the room had already shifted, something irreversible, the kind of shift that happens before anyone fully understands it, the kind that turns certainty into doubt and control into exposure. And somewhere behind the counter, the system screen still glowed with a name that did not match the narrative Ryan was trying to hold together, and Lily, standing between silence and truth, knew that whatever happened next was going to change everything. The silence that followed Lily's words did not break the room. It reshaped it. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like something invisible had shifted into place, and no one could quite ignore it anymore. Ryan Caldwell stood still for a fraction of a second longer than he intended, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward Lily, irritation rising first, then something else, something smaller, less familiar, doubt. But he pushed it down quickly, straightening his shoulders as if posture alone could restore the certainty he had already committed to. "I said not now," he repeated, sharper this time, his tone carrying the weight of someone trying to reassert control before it slipped further. But Lily did not look away, and that alone was unusual. She had worked under Ryan long enough to know how these moments usually ended, with silence, with compliance, with the situation quietly dissolved before it ever had to be questioned. But this was not dissolving. It was tightening, and the name on her screen did not disappear just because she wished it would. Malcolm Hayes, owner-level access. The system did not guess. It confirmed, and now it was sitting there, unblinking, undeniable. "You should really look," she said again, softer, but steadier. And this time, a few heads in the showroom turned more openly, no longer pretending not to notice, because something in her voice had changed, something that did not match a routine interruption. Malcolm remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his hand lowering slowly from his phone back to his side, as if whatever he had set in motion no longer required his attention, his eyes never leaving Ryan. Not confrontational, not aggressive, but unwavering, and that steadiness began to press against the edges of Ryan's confidence in a way that words alone had not. "There is nothing to check," Ryan said, but the sentence came out a fraction too quickly, a fraction too defensive, and that was enough for the room to feel it. The couple by the watches exchanged a glance, one of them shifting their weight as if deciding whether to stay or step closer. The other associate froze completely now, no longer pretending to adjust anything, because this was no longer a normal interaction. This was something else, something that felt like it was about to turn. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the moment without interrupting it. "Then you have nothing to worry about," he said, and the simplicity of that response made it land heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it removed the need for argument. It removed the need for defense. It placed the next move entirely in Ryan's hands. And for the first time since Malcolm walked in, Ryan did not immediately take it. His eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward Lily's tablet, then back to Malcolm, then back again. A small motion, barely noticeable, but enough to reveal that the certainty he had been standing on was no longer solid, just stable enough to stand, but not enough to trust. Lily saw it, and that gave her just enough courage to shift the tablet slightly, angling it so the screen was more visible, not aggressively, not publicly, just enough that if Ryan chose to look, he would see it clearly. And now the decision was no longer about Malcolm. It was about whether Ryan was willing to confirm what he already suspected might be true. The seconds stretched, thin and fragile, and then finally, Ryan took a step closer to the counter, his movement controlled, measured, as if he was still in charge of the situation, as if this was simply part of his process, not a reaction, his eyes dropping to the screen, scanning quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping. And in that moment, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for someone across the room to catch, but enough for those closest to him to feel it. The tightness in his jaw loosened just slightly, the line between his brows deepened, and for the first time, his silence was not strategic. It was real. Malcolm watched it happen without moving, without speaking, as if he had seen that exact sequence unfold before, as if he knew the exact moment the ground beneath someone's certainty would begin to crack, and he did not rush it. He let it happen, because that was the point. Ryan blinked once, then again, his eyes moving back over the screen as if checking for error, for some indication that the system was wrong, that this was a glitch, a mislabel, anything that would allow him to return to the version of the situation he understood. But the name did not change, the access level did not disappear, and the longer he looked, the less room there was to deny it. He straightened slowly, turning his head back toward Malcolm, and now, for the first time, the distance between them felt different, not because the space had changed, but because the meaning of it had. The line that Ryan had drawn at the beginning of the interaction no longer held the same authority. It had been based on assumption, and now that assumption had been exposed, not loudly, not publicly, but clearly. The room seemed to hold its breath, not because anyone fully understood what was happening yet, but because they could feel that something had shifted beyond repair, the kind of shift that does not reverse itself once it begins. Malcolm's voice came again, quiet, controlled, but now carrying something new. Not emotion, not anger, but clarity sharpened into presence. "Go ahead," he said. And it was not a suggestion. It was not a request. It was permission, the kind that only comes from someone who already knows the outcome. Ryan opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, then stopped, the words catching somewhere between intention and realization. And in that pause, everything that had been said before seemed to rearrange itself. Every assumption, every tone, every decision, all of it now sitting under a different light, one that did not soften anything, but made everything visible. Lily stepped back half a pace, her role in the moment complete, her eyes moving between the two men, aware now that whatever came next was no longer about whether Malcolm would be served. It was about what happened after the truth had already arrived. And Malcolm, still standing in front of the case, still calm, still composed, waited, not because he needed an answer, but because he understood something Ryan was only just beginning to learn, that the most powerful moment in any room is not when someone raises their voice. It is when the truth stands there quietly and refuses to move. Ryan Caldwell did not speak right away, and that silence, stretched thin across polished marble and glass, carried more weight than any command he had given minutes earlier, his eyes still fixed on the tablet screen, the name refusing to disappear, the authority level refusing to downgrade, the system refusing to bend to his expectations. And in that refusal, something inside him began to recalibrate, not gracefully, not instantly, but undeniably. He inhaled slowly, as if trying to regain control of the rhythm of the room, then straightened his posture once more, but this time the adjustment felt different, less like confidence and more like correction, a subtle attempt to realign himself with a reality he had not prepared for. Malcolm did not move, did not rush, did not speak, his stillness now filling the space with a quiet pressure that made every second feel deliberate, like the room itself was waiting for Ryan to decide which version of himself would respond next. The couple near the watches stepped a little closer now, no longer pretending to browse, their attention fully anchored to the center of the showroom, while the other associate stood completely still, hands clasped lightly in front of her, unsure whether to intervene or remain invisible. And Lily, standing just behind the counter, felt the shift most clearly, because she had seen the system, she had seen the truth before it reached anyone else, and now she was watching it unfold in real time. Ryan finally lifted his gaze from the screen and looked directly at Malcolm again. But the look had changed, the certainty that once sharpened his tone now softened into something more cautious, more measured, and for the first time, he did not speak as quickly as before. He chose his words, or at least tried to. "If there has been some kind of misunderstanding," he began, his voice controlled but no longer edged with dismissal, "we can clarify that." And even that sentence, carefully constructed, revealed more than he intended, because it shifted the ground from assumption to uncertainty, from authority to negotiation. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, but his presence now unmistakably anchored in the room. "There has not been a misunderstanding," he said calmly, and the clarity of that statement left no space for reinterpretation. It did not accuse, it did not escalate, it simply defined, and in doing so, it forced Ryan to confront the situation without the comfort of ambiguity. Ryan's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not from irritation. It was from the realization that the path he had been on no longer held, that the script he had been following had already been rewritten without his permission, and now he had to respond without the certainty he relied on. He glanced once more at the display case, at the ring Malcolm had asked to see, then back at Malcolm himself, and for a brief moment, the simplest solution presented itself: open the case, hand over the ring, move forward. But even that was no longer simple, because it was no longer just about service. It was about everything that had already been said before this moment, everything that could not be unsaid. Malcolm watched that hesitation unfold, not with impatience, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet understanding, because he had seen this moment before, in different rooms, with different faces, but always the same pattern, the moment when someone realized that the judgment they had made was not just incorrect, but exposed. The overhead lights reflected off the glass case again, casting small fragments of light across Malcolm's face, and for a brief second, his eyes shifted, not toward Ryan, but toward the reflection itself, as if something deeper, something older, had surfaced beneath the present moment. He was 21 again, standing in a smaller store on the south side of Chicago, wearing a pressed shirt he could barely afford, asking to see a watch he had saved for months to buy, and hearing the same tone, the same hesitation, the same quiet refusal disguised as policy. And back then, he had stepped away, not because he wanted to, but because he had no leverage to stay, no authority to challenge the narrative that had already been written for him. The memory did not linger long. It did not need to. It simply sharpened the present, brought it into focus with a clarity that made everything else fall away. Malcolm's gaze returned to Ryan, steady, grounded. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that weight. Not heavy, not emotional, but certain. "You had a choice," he said, and the sentence did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a record, like something already documented, already complete, and you made it. And with that, the room seemed to tighten once more, not with tension this time, but with recognition. Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but in it was the first sign of something shifting internally, not just externally, his shoulders lowering slightly, his stance no longer defensive but not yet resolved, caught between reaction and acceptance. He looked at Malcolm, really looked this time, not at the hoodie, not at the sneakers, not at the surface-level signals he had relied on before, but at the man standing in front of him, the composure, the control, the absence of any need to prove anything. And in that observation, the reality of the situation settled more firmly into place. Behind him, Lily took a small step back, giving the space room to breathe, her role now complete, her presence no longer required to push the truth forward, because it had already arrived. The couple near the watches exchanged another glance, one of them nodding slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken, something that did not need to be explained. Malcolm remained still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture unchanged, but his presence now defined the room in a way that no title or introduction could have done earlier. Ryan swallowed once, a small, involuntary motion, then reached toward the display case, his hand pausing just above the lock, hovering there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if the act of opening it now carried more weight than it should have. And perhaps it did, because it was no longer just about a piece of jewelry. It was about what that action represented: acknowledgement, correction, consequence. Malcolm watched the movement without reacting, without stepping forward, without signaling approval or expectation, because he did not need to. The moment was already unfolding exactly as it needed to. And in that quiet, controlled space, where no one raised their voice and no one moved too quickly, the truth did what it always does when it is no longer resisted. It stood, it held, and it waited for everyone else to catch up. Ryan's hand hovered over the glass case, fingers just inches from the lock, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. He did nothing, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood that whatever he did next would not just move the situation forward, it would define it. The polished showroom lights reflected off the surface of the case, catching the tension in his hand, the hesitation that had replaced the certainty he carried only minutes earlier. And behind him, the room remained still, not silent, but focused, every eye now anchored to that single unfinished motion. Malcolm Hayes did not shift, did not lean in, did not rush the moment, his presence steady, grounded, as if time itself had slowed to match his pace, his eyes resting on Ryan with the same calm clarity that had unsettled him from the start, not demanding, not forcing, simply there, unmovable. Lily Tran stood a few feet back now, her tablet lowered slightly, but still in her hands, the screen dimming after inactivity. Though the information it held had already done its work, her breathing even but her attention sharp, aware that the next few seconds would carry more weight than everything that had come before. The couple near the watches had stepped closer still, their curiosity no longer hidden, the man's arms folded loosely, the woman's hand resting near her side, both watching with the quiet understanding that they were witnessing something more than a customer interaction, something that felt like a line being redrawn in real time. Ryan finally moved, his fingers pressing lightly against the lock, the small click that followed echoing louder than expected in the controlled quiet of the showroom. And as the glass case lifted slightly, the shift in the room became tangible, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable, like a door opening that could not be closed again. He reached inside carefully, retrieving the ring Malcolm had pointed to earlier, holding it between his fingers with the same precision he had used countless times before. But now the movement lacked its usual ease, replaced instead with a measured caution, as if the object itself carried more weight than its price tag suggested. He placed the ring on the velvet tray in front of Malcolm, his voice coming out controlled, but lower, more restrained. "Here it is," he said, and even that simple sentence felt different, stripped of its earlier tone, no longer filtering the interaction through assumption, but responding to a reality he could no longer ignore. Malcolm looked down at the ring, not immediately reaching for it, not reacting with excitement or urgency, but simply observing, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if the piece itself was not the point, as if it had never been. He let the moment breathe, then slowly extended his hand, lifting the ring with a careful grip, turning it slightly under the light, watching how it caught and reflected, how it responded to movement, how it revealed its quality without needing explanation. 3.2 carats, Malcolm said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice smooth, familiar with the details in a way that did not sound rehearsed. "Internally flawless," he added, glancing briefly at the band, confirming what he already knew. Ryan watched him closely now, his expression tightened, not defensive, but searching, trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the version he had constructed minutes earlier, and finding no overlap between the two. Malcolm lowered the ring slightly, his fingers still holding it, then looked back up at Ryan, his eyes calm but sharper now, not in anger, but in clarity. "You know," he said, his tone even, "this piece was part of a limited acquisition." And that sentence landed differently, not because of what it said, but because of how it was said, like a continuation of something larger, something beyond the scope of a single sale. Ryan's brow furrowed slightly, his attention narrowing. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "It came in earlier this quarter." And even as he said it, there was a subtle shift in his tone, less certain, more aware, as if he was beginning to understand that he was no longer leading the conversation. Malcolm nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then rotated the ring again, examining the setting, the cut, the precision, every detail aligning with a standard he had approved himself months ago. And that realization, quiet and controlled, settled into his posture, grounding him further in the moment. "It was selected for this location specifically," Malcolm continued, his voice still calm, still measured, "based on projected demand in this market." And now, the words began to draw a line, not overtly, not aggressively, but clearly enough that Ryan felt it. The connection forming between the man holding the ring and the decisions that had brought it into the store in the first place. Ryan's eyes narrowed just slightly, his mind working through the implications, the details, the context, and for the first time, the question he had not asked at the beginning began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet spoken, but present. Malcolm looked at him for a long second, then placed the ring back onto the velvet tray with a controlled motion, not dismissive, not careless, just final, as if he had seen everything he needed to see. The room remained still, the weight of the moment settling into every corner, into every reflection on glass and marble, into every quiet breath held just a second longer than usual. Malcolm straightened slightly, not changing his stance, but refining it, his presence now unmistakably defined. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority that had been building since the moment he walked in. "Tell me something," he said, and the simplicity of the phrase drew every remaining thread of attention toward him. "How long have you been managing this store?" And the question, on its surface, seemed ordinary, almost procedural, but in the context of everything that had unfolded, it landed with a different weight entirely, not as curiosity, not as conversation, but as something else, something that signaled the next phase of what was no longer just an interaction, but a reckoning quietly taking shape. Ryan Caldwell did not answer immediately, and this time the silence did not feel like hesitation alone. It felt like exposure, like the question had reached past the surface of his role and settled somewhere deeper, somewhere he had not expected to be challenged. His eyes stayed on Malcolm for a moment longer, searching, recalibrating, trying to understand why a simple question carried so much weight. Then he cleared his throat slightly, a small, controlled gesture that attempted to restore structure to a moment that had already slipped beyond it. Almost 3 years, he said, his voice measured, but no longer carrying the same certainty it once had. And as soon as the words left his mouth, they seemed to hang there, not as a statement of experience, but as a point of reference, something that could now be evaluated rather than assumed. Malcolm nodded slowly, acknowledging the answer without reacting to it, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if placing that information into a larger framework only he could see. 3 years, he repeated quietly, not questioning, not doubting, simply confirming. And then his eyes shifted briefly, scanning the showroom once more, the layout, the staff, the atmosphere that had been shaped under Ryan's management. And in that brief glance, there was no judgment visible, only observation, precise and complete. The couple standing nearby exchanged another look, their attention now fully invested, while the other associate remained still, her posture slightly more rigid than before, aware that whatever was unfolding had moved beyond a simple interaction and into something that carried consequences. Lily stood just behind the counter, her hands now resting lightly against the edge, her tablet set aside, no longer needed, because the truth it had revealed had already taken root in the room, and now she watched, not as an observer, but as someone who understood that this moment would define more than just one conversation. Malcolm's voice came again, calm, controlled, but now carrying a subtle shift, not in tone, but in direction. And in those 3 years, he said, how do you decide who gets your attention first? And the question, simple on the surface, unfolded into something far more complex the moment it was asked, because it did not challenge policy, it challenged perception. It did not question procedure, it questioned judgment. And in doing so, it placed Ryan in a position where the answer could no longer rely on assumption alone. Ryan's brow tightened slightly, the question forcing him into a space he had not prepared for, his mind moving quickly through the usual responses, customer priority, appointment scheduling, purchase intent, but none of those felt sufficient now. Not in this moment, not under this gaze. We prioritize based on engagement, he said finally, the word chosen carefully. But even as he said it, it lacked the confidence it would have carried earlier, because the room itself no longer supported it. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, considering the answer. Engagement, he repeated, and this time there was a faint shift in his expression, not a smile, not approval, but recognition, as if the word itself revealed more than Ryan intended. And how do you measure that? He asked, and now the questions were not just questions, they were a sequence, a structure, a quiet unraveling of the logic that had governed the interaction from the start. Ryan exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting again, not defensively, but cautiously, aware now that each response carried weight beyond the immediate conversation. Body language, questions, intent. He replied, his tone more restrained, more deliberate, but still holding on to the framework he had relied on. You can usually tell who is serious, and as the words settled, the room seemed to tighten once more, not because of volume, but because of clarity, because everyone present now understood what had been implied from the beginning, and now it was being articulated, carefully, but clearly. Malcolm nodded once, absorbing the answer, then let a brief silence settle between them, not to create tension, but to allow the meaning to fully land. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority that had defined every word he had said so far. And earlier, he said, you decided I was not. And this time, the statement did not invite denial. It did not leave room for reinterpretation. It simply placed the moment back into context, aligning everything that had happened with the reasoning Ryan had just explained. Ryan's jaw tightened again, the realization settling deeper now, no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate, connected directly to his own words, his own decisions. And for a moment, he did not respond, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that any answer now would not change what had already been established. Malcolm did not press, did not raise his voice, did not escalate. He simply stood there, allowing the weight of the moment to exist without interference, because he did not need to add to it. It was already complete. Behind him, the couple remained still, their attention unwavering, the woman's expression now more serious, more focused, as if she was processing not just what was happening, but what it represented, while the man beside her nodded almost imperceptibly, acknowledging something unspoken. Lily shifted her weight slightly, her eyes moving between Malcolm and Ryan, aware that this was no longer about a single decision, but about a pattern, a system of judgment that had just been laid out in the open, and she could see it clearly now. The difference between assumption and truth, between perception and reality, and the cost of confusing the two. Malcolm finally moved, just a small shift, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the display case, grounding himself in the space he had built, the space that had just revealed itself in a way few ever saw. And when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. 3 years is enough time to understand what this place represents, he said, but it is also enough time to shape what it becomes. And the sentence did not accuse, it did not condemn, it simply defined responsibility, placing it exactly where it belonged. Ryan swallowed once, the motion small but visible, his posture no longer rigid, no longer fixed, but unsettled, caught between the version of himself he had been and the reality now standing in front of him. And in that space, the certainty he once relied on had been replaced by something else, something quieter, but far more difficult to ignore, awareness. Malcolm looked at him for a long second, then added, "The question is not whether you can tell who is serious," he said, his tone steady. "It is whether you know what you are actually seeing." And with that, the room settled into a new kind of silence, one that did not wait for action, but for understanding, the kind that does not demand a response, but requires one. Nonetheless, the silence that followed Malcolm's last sentence did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with something unspoken but fully understood. And for the first time since this interaction began, Ryan Caldwell did not try to fill it immediately. He stood there, his posture no longer rigid, no longer anchored in assumption, but suspended in a space where every previous decision had begun to echo back at him, not loudly, not accusingly, but clearly. His eyes drifted for a brief moment, not away from Malcolm entirely, but slightly past him, as if trying to reset his perspective, to regain the vantage point he had held just minutes earlier. But it was gone, replaced by a reality that did not align with his initial judgment, and that shift, subtle but irreversible, settled into the way he breathed, the way he stood, the way he now looked at the man in front of him. Malcolm remained still, his presence unchanged. His gaze steady but not pressing, not forcing, simply there, allowing the weight of the moment to do its work. Because he understood something Ryan was only beginning to realize, that once perception is challenged by truth, it does not return to its original state. It evolves, or it collapses. The showroom lights continued to reflect softly across the glass and metal surfaces, the environment unchanged, but the meaning of the space now different. As if the room itself had been recalibrated without moving a single object. Lily Tran stood quietly behind the counter, her hands resting lightly at her sides now, no longer holding the tablet, no longer needing it. Her role complete, but her awareness sharper than ever. She had seen the shift from the inside, from the system, and now she was watching it unfold in real time. The gap between assumption and reality closing in a way that could not be undone. The couple near the watches remained where they were, but their posture had changed, no longer casual, no longer observational, but engaged, the woman's expression thoughtful, the man's gaze steady, both of them understanding that what they were witnessing was not just about service, but about something deeper, something structural, something that extended beyond this one interaction. Ryan finally spoke, but his voice had changed, not dramatically enough to draw attention in any other context, but here, in this moment, it was unmistakable. "I made a judgment," he said, and the sentence did not defend itself, it did not justify, it simply existed, a statement of fact. And in that simplicity, it carried more honesty than anything he had said before. Malcolm nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, but acknowledging, because that was the first step, not correction, not apology, but recognition. Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but real, and, for the first time, his eyes met Malcolm's without trying to assert authority, without trying to hold ground, but simply to meet him where he stood. And I was wrong, he added, and the words did not come easily, not because they were difficult to say, but because they required him to step outside the framework he had relied on for years, the one that told him he could read people, that he could assess value at a glance, that he could decide who belonged and who did not without needing to ask. Malcolm did not react immediately. He let the words settle, let them exist in the space without rushing to respond, because he knew that acknowledgement alone did not resolve what had already happened. It only opened the door to what came next. The room remained still, the air no longer tense, but heavy with understanding, the kind that does not dissipate quickly, the kind that lingers, shaping what follows. Malcolm's voice came again, calm, even, but now carrying a clarity that felt sharper than before, not in tone, but in direction. It was not just a judgment, he said, and the sentence did not contradict Ryan. It expanded on him. It was a decision. And with that, the moment deepened, the distinction subtle but critical, because judgment could be abstract, but decision was action, it was outcome, it was consequence. Ryan's gaze lowered slightly, not in submission, but in reflection, the weight of that distinction settling in, because he could see it now, not just what he thought, but what he did, how that thought translated into behavior, into refusal, into exclusion, and how quickly it had happened without question. Malcolm took a slow breath, his posture unchanged, but his presence now carrying a different kind of authority, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that reveals itself through control, through restraint, through the absence of reaction where reaction might be expected. And decisions, he continued, shape experiences, and the words moved through the room with a quiet precision, connecting everything that had happened in a way that did not need to be explained further. The couple near the watches exchanged another glance, the man nodding slightly, the woman's expression softening into something more reflective, because they understood now that this was not about a single moment, but about a pattern, one that could exist anywhere, in any space, under any set of assumptions. Lily shifted her weight subtly, her eyes moving between Malcolm and Ryan, aware that the conversation had reached a point where it was no longer about what had happened, but about what would happen next. And in that awareness, she felt something settle within herself as well, a clarity about the difference between following a system and questioning it. Ryan lifted his gaze again, his posture more grounded now, less reactive, more present. What happens next? He asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried the full weight of everything that had led to it, not as a request for instruction, but as an acknowledgement that the outcome was no longer his to define alone. Malcolm looked at him for a long second, his expression unchanged, but his eyes steady, focused, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but unmistakably firm. Now, he said, we address it. And the words did not signal an end. They signaled a shift, from exposure to accountability, from realization to action, and in that shift, the room seemed to settle into a new kind of stillness, one that did not resist what was coming, but accepted that it could no longer be avoided. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, and for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure of what was happening, but because they understood that whatever came next would not be undone. It would be recorded, remembered, and carried forward beyond this space. Malcolm Hayes stood where he had been from the beginning, grounded, composed, his presence no longer questioned, no longer interpreted, but fully recognized. And in that recognition, the entire showroom felt different, not in its design, not in its lighting, but in its meaning. Ryan Caldwell inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling, in a controlled rhythm, as if preparing himself for something he had not anticipated when the day began, his eyes no longer scanning for control, but focusing inward, processing, recalibrating, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that had been missing before, not because he had regained authority, but because he had accepted responsibility. "What do you need from me?" he asked, and the question, simple and direct, marked a shift from defense to accountability, from reaction to intention. Malcolm's gaze remained steady, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, not a movement forward, but a refinement of presence, as if the moment had reached a point where clarity no longer needed to build, it simply needed to be applied. "I need you to understand what happened here," he said, his tone calm, measured, but unmistakably firm, and the sentence did not carry anger. It carried expectation, the kind that does not rise in volume, but in weight. Ryan nodded once, slowly, the motion deliberate, acknowledging not just the words, but the responsibility behind them. "I do," he replied, and this time, the answer did not feel like an attempt to resolve the situation quickly. It felt like a step into it, a willingness to stand in the discomfort rather than move past it. Malcolm let the moment settle, then continued. "Understanding is not just recognizing that you were wrong," he said. "It is knowing why you were wrong, and what allowed it to happen." And as he spoke, the words moved through the room with a quiet precision, not aimed at Ryan alone, but at everyone present, because the pattern he was describing was not isolated. It was shared. It existed in systems, in habits, in unspoken rules that shaped behavior long before anyone questioned them. Lily felt the words land differently, not because they were directed at her, but because she could see how easily she could have stayed silent, how easily she could have followed the same pattern without interruption, and that realization settled into her posture, grounding her in a way she had not expected. The couple nearby remained still, their attention unwavering, the woman's expression now thoughtful, almost reflective, while the man beside her nodded slightly again, as if acknowledging something that extended beyond the walls of the store. Ryan's eyes lowered briefly, not in avoidance, but in reflection, the question Malcolm had posed turning inward, forcing him to examine not just this moment, but the patterns that had led to it, the assumptions he had relied on, the shortcuts he had taken, the decisions he had made without question. And as those realizations surfaced, they did not come with noise or resistance. They came with clarity, sharp and undeniable. He looked back up, his gaze steady now, no longer searching for control, but for alignment. "It was how I saw you," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "before I gave you a chance to be anything else." And the honesty in that statement settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that did not need to be challenged, because it had already confronted itself. Malcolm nodded once, acknowledging the truth in it, then added, "And that is the part that matters." His tone still even, still controlled, but carrying a depth that had been building since the beginning. Because what you saw was not based on information, it was based on assumption. And the distinction, simple but precise, drew a line between perception and reality that could no longer be blurred. Ryan absorbed that, the clarity of it settling in, reshaping the way he understood not just this interaction, but the framework he had been operating within, and for the first time, he did not try to respond immediately. He let the understanding take hold, let it settle, let it change something within him before speaking again. Malcolm took a slow breath, his presence steady, his voice calm, but now carrying a quiet authority that no longer needed to prove itself. "This store represents more than inventory," he said. "It represents trust, access, and respect." And as he spoke, the words moved beyond the physical space, beyond the glass cases and the velvet trays, into something more fundamental, something that defined the experience itself. He paused briefly, allowing the meaning to settle, then continued. "And the moment you decide who deserves that without knowing who they are, you are no longer managing a store," he said, his tone firm but controlled. "You are controlling access based on perception." And with that, the full weight of the situation became clear, not just what had happened, but what it meant. The room remained still, but the stillness had changed again. No longer tense, no longer uncertain, but grounded in understanding, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that stays. Ryan stood there, absorbing every word, his posture no longer defensive, no longer reactive, but present, fully present in a way that required him to confront not just this moment, but the pattern behind it, And in that presence, something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Malcolm looked at him for a long second, then said, "So now we correct it." And the words did not signal punishment. They signaled process, not reaction, but response. And in that distinction, the next step became clear, not as an option, but as a necessity. Ryan nodded again, this time without hesitation, without uncertainty, the motion grounded in understanding rather than obligation. And as the moment settled into its next phase, the showroom no longer felt like a place of quiet luxury alone. It felt like a place where something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen, and something that would now require change. The words did not fade after Malcolm spoke them. They stayed in the air, steady and undeniable, like a structure that had been built piece by piece throughout the entire exchange and was now standing complete in front of everyone. And for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that what came next would not be guided by habit, it would be guided by truth. Malcolm Hayes stood with the same calm presence he had carried from the moment he walked in, but now, that presence no longer needed to be interpreted. It had been revealed, defined, and accepted, not through announcement, but through clarity, and that made it stronger than anything he could have declared at the door. Ryan Caldwell took a slow breath, his shoulders settling into a position that no longer tried to project authority, but instead reflected awareness, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but more grounded than it had been at any point before. "What does correction look like?" he asked, and the question, simple on its surface, carried the full weight of accountability behind it, not as a request to escape consequence, but as a step toward understanding it. Malcolm's eyes remained steady on him, his expression unchanged, but his presence sharpened slightly, not in intensity, but in focus, as if the moment had reached the point where action would now follow meaning. "It starts with ownership," he said, his tone calm but firm, and the word did not refer to title or position. It referred to responsibility, to acknowledgement, to the willingness to stand in what had happened without shifting it elsewhere. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing the word not as a concept, but as a requirement, and for a moment he glanced around the showroom, at the staff, at the customers, at the space he had managed for 3 years, and in that glance he saw it differently, not as a place he controlled, but as a place he had influenced, shaped through decisions that now stood in front of him with undeniable clarity. Malcolm continued, "You acknowledge what happened, clearly, directly, and without minimizing it," he said, and his voice carried the kind of precision that left no room for interpretation, not just to me, but to everyone who witnessed it. And with that, the scope of the moment expanded beyond the two of them, beyond the counter, beyond the immediate interaction, into the shared space that had been affected by it. Ryan's gaze followed that shift, moving toward the couple standing nearby, toward Lily behind the counter, toward the other associate who had remained silent throughout. And in that movement, the realization deepened. This was not private, it was not contained, it was visible, and therefore it required a response that matched that visibility. He inhaled again, steadying himself, then turned slightly, his posture adjusting as he faced the room more openly, not fully stepping away from Malcolm, but no longer positioning himself solely in front of him. And when he spoke, his voice carried a clarity that had not been present before. "I made an assumption based on appearance," he said, each word measured, deliberate, "and I allowed that assumption to determine how I treated a customer." And the sentence, simple and direct, settled into the room with a weight that did not need to be reinforced, because it was complete in itself. The couple listened without interruption, the woman's expression softening slightly, not in approval, but in recognition, while the man beside her nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the shift. Lily stood still, her eyes steady, her posture grounded, hearing the words not as a resolution, but as a beginning, because she understood that acknowledgement was only the first step, not the last. Ryan continued, his voice steady. "That decision did not reflect the standard this store is meant to uphold," he added, and as he said it, the words aligned not just with Malcolm's presence, but with the space itself, the expectation that had been set long before this moment and had now been tested in a way that exposed its vulnerability. Malcolm watched without interrupting, his gaze steady. allowing the process to unfold without guiding every step. Because the point was not control, it was accountability, and that required Ryan to move through it himself. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but attentive, receptive, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that mattered beyond this moment. Ryan's shoulders lowered slightly as he finished speaking, not in relief, but in release, the kind that comes from saying something that cannot be taken back, something that defines a moment rather than avoiding it. Malcolm took a slow breath, then nodded once, acknowledging the step, not as completion, but as progression. That is where it begins, he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a subtle shift, as if the process had now moved into its next phase. But correction is not just what you say, he continued. It is what changes after this moment. And the words redirected the focus forward, away from what had been said and toward what would now be done. Ryan absorbed that, his posture steady, his attention fully engaged, understanding now that acknowledgement alone would not redefine the experience. It would only open the path for something else to take its place. Malcolm's gaze moved briefly across the showroom again, taking in the space with a quiet precision, then returned to Ryan. This store does not need to guess who deserves respect, he said, his tone firm but controlled. It gives it, consistently, without condition. And with that, the standard was no longer implied. It was defined. The couple exchanged another glance, the woman's expression thoughtful, the man's nod slightly more pronounced, both of them understanding that what they had just heard was not just a correction, but a principle. Lily felt something settle within her again, a clarity about what the space should be, not based on perception, but on consistency. And in that clarity, she stood a little straighter, her presence more grounded than before. Ryan nodded once more, this time without hesitation, without uncertainty, the motion firm, aligned. Understood, he said, and the word carried more weight now than any explanation could have, because it was not just agreement, it was acceptance. Malcolm looked at him for a long second, then said, "Good." And the simplicity of the response marked a transition, not an end, but a movement forward. And in that movement, the showroom felt different again, not because anything physical had changed, but because something fundamental had been addressed, and now, for the first time since the moment began, the space felt aligned with what it was meant to represent. The words settled, simple and complete, and for a moment the showroom held that stillness like a breath that had finally been released, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet shift that changed everything without moving a single object. Malcolm Hayes stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but the atmosphere around him no longer carried tension, it carried alignment, the kind that comes when something has been brought into the open and addressed. Without distortion, Ryan Caldwell remained facing him, but now there was no distance in his stance, no invisible barrier built from assumption, only the space between two people standing in the same reality, one who had revealed it, and one who had finally stepped into it. The overhead lights reflected across the glass cases as they had from the beginning, but now the reflections felt clearer, sharper, as if the room itself had adjusted to match the clarity that had been established. Malcolm let the moment settle fully before speaking again, his voice calm, measured, but now carrying a finality that had not been present before, not because it was louder, but because it was complete. "Now we formalize it," he said, and the sentence shifted the moment from understanding into action, from internal acknowledgement into external consequence. Ryan nodded once, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with a grounded acceptance, his posture steady, his attention fully aligned with what was being asked of him. "Yes," he replied, and the word was not reactive, it was intentional. Malcolm reached into his pocket again, the same deliberate motion as before, and brought out his phone, his thumb moving across the screen with precise familiarity, not rushed, not uncertain, as if every step had already been mapped out long before this moment arrived. The room remained still, but the stillness had changed again, no longer waiting, no longer questioning, but observing with a quiet awareness that something definitive was about to take place. Lily stood just behind the counter, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture composed but attentive, her eyes following Malcolm's movements with a clarity that came from understanding exactly what was unfolding, not just in the room, but beyond it. The couple nearby remained where they were, their attention steady, their presence now part of the moment rather than separate from it, as if they understood that what they were witnessing was not just a resolution, but a standard being set. Malcolm lifted his gaze from his phone back to Ryan, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carrying a weight that did not need to be explained. "This location operates under a system," he said, his tone even, controlled, but precise. "And that system tracks not just sales, but conduct." And as he spoke, the words moved through the room with a quiet authority, connecting the moment to something larger, something structured, something that extended beyond individual perception. Ryan listened without interruption, his posture steady, his attention fully engaged, understanding now that the process had moved beyond conversation and into something formal, something that would be documented, reviewed, and acted upon. Malcolm continued. "Every interaction, every decision, every deviation from standard protocol," he said, "is part of that system." And the clarity of his words left no room for interpretation, no space for uncertainty, only a direct connection between action and consequence. He paused briefly, allowing the meaning to settle, then added, "And today's interaction is now part of that record." And with that, the moment shifted again, not emotionally, not dramatically, but structurally, the kind of shift that redefines what happens next. Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, his shoulders settling further into a posture that no longer resisted, but accepted, his eyes steady on Malcolm, not searching, not questioning, but present, fully present in the reality that had been established. Malcolm's thumb tapped the screen once more, a precise motion, and somewhere beyond the walls of the showroom, the system responded, not loudly, not visibly, but effectively, initiating a process that did not require explanation to those who understood it. Lily felt the shift immediately, not through sound or movement, but through recognition, the kind that comes from knowing how systems work, how actions translate into records, how records translate into outcomes. And in that recognition, her posture straightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of clarity. Malcolm lowered his phone slowly, his gaze returning fully to Ryan. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice calm, but now carrying a finality that could not be mistaken. "Your role as manager of this location is under review." And the sentence did not rise in volume. It did not carry anger, but it carried authority, the kind that does not need to assert itself, because it is already established. The room absorbed the words in silence, not shocked, not reactive, but aware, because everything that had led to this moment had made it inevitable, not sudden, but earned. Ryan stood still, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in resistance, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of the outcome that matched the clarity of the process that had led to it. He opened them again, his gaze returning to Malcolm, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, grounded. "Understood," he said, and the word carried no defensiveness, no attempt to negotiate, only alignment with the reality that had been established. Malcolm nodded once, a small, precise motion that acknowledged the response, not as agreement, but as completion of the step, and then his gaze shifted briefly across the showroom, taking in the space one more time, not as a visitor, not as an observer, but as someone who had built it, defined it, and now reinforced what it was meant to represent. The lights continued to reflect across the glass, the room unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally different in meaning, and in that quiet, controlled space, where no voice had been raised and no movement had been rushed, the system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had revealed, it had recorded, and now it had acted. The words settled, simple and complete, and for a moment the showroom held that stillness like a breath that had finally been released, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet shift that changed everything without moving a single object. Malcolm Hayes stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but the atmosphere around him no longer carried tension, it carried alignment. the kind that comes when something has been brought into the open and addressed. Without distortion, Ryan Caldwell remained facing him, but now there was no distance in his stance, no invisible barrier built from assumption, only the space between two people standing in the same reality, one who had revealed it, and one who had finally stepped into it. The overhead lights reflected across the glass cases as they had from the beginning, but now the reflections felt clearer, sharper, as if the room itself had adjusted to match the clarity that had been established. "Malcolm, let the moment settle fully before speaking again," his voice calm, measured, but now carrying a finality that had not been present before, not because it was louder, but because it was complete. "Now we formalize it," he said, and the sentence shifted the moment from understanding into action, from internal acknowledgement into external consequence. Ryan nodded once, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with a grounded acceptance, his posture steady, his attention fully aligned with what was being asked of him. "Yes," he replied, and the word was not reactive, it was intentional. Malcolm reached into his pocket again, the same deliberate motion as before, and brought out his phone, his thumb moving across the screen with precise familiarity, not rushed, not uncertain, as if every step had already been mapped out long before this moment arrived. The room remained still, but the stillness had changed again. No longer waiting, no longer questioning, but observing with a quiet awareness that something definitive was about to take place. Lily stood just behind the counter, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture composed but attentive, her eyes following Malcolm's movements with a clarity that came from understanding exactly what was unfolding, not just in the room, but beyond it. The couple nearby remained where they were, their attention steady, their presence now part of the moment rather than separate from it, as if they understood that what they were witnessing was not just a resolution, but a standard being set. Malcolm lifted his gaze from his phone back to Ryan, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carrying a weight that did not need to be explained. "This location operates under a system," he said, his tone even, controlled, but precise, and that system tracks not just sales, but conduct. And as he spoke, the words moved through the room with a quiet authority, connecting the moment to something larger, something structured, something that extended beyond individual perception. Ryan listened without interruption, his posture steady, his attention fully engaged, understanding now that the process had moved beyond conversation and into something formal, something that would be documented, reviewed, and acted upon. Malcolm continued, "Every interaction, every decision, every deviation from standard protocol," he said, "is part of that system." And the clarity of his words left no room for interpretation, no space for uncertainty, only a direct connection between action and consequence. He paused briefly, allowing the meaning to settle, then added, "And today's interaction is now part of that record." And with that, the moment shifted again, not emotionally, not dramatically, but structurally, the kind of shift that redefines what happens next. Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, his shoulders settling further into a posture that no longer resisted, but accepted, his eyes steady on Malcolm, not searching, not questioning, but present, fully present in the reality that had been established. Malcolm's thumb tapped the screen once more, a precise motion, and somewhere beyond the walls of the showroom, the system responded, not loudly, not visibly, but effectively, initiating a process that did not require explanation. To those who understood it, Lily felt the shift immediately, not through sound or movement, but through recognition, the kind that comes from knowing how systems work, how actions translate into records, how records translate into outcomes. And in that recognition, her posture straightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of clarity. Malcolm lowered his phone slowly, his gaze returning fully to Ryan. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice calm, but now carrying a finality that could not be mistaken. "Your role as manager of this location is under review." And the sentence did not rise in volume. It did not carry anger, but it carried authority, the kind that does not need to assert itself, because it is already established. The room absorbed the words in silence, not shocked, not reactive, but aware, because everything that had led to this moment had made it inevitable, not sudden, but earned. Ryan stood still, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in resistance, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of the outcome that matched the clarity of the process that had led to it. He opened them again, his gaze returning to Malcolm, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, grounded. "Understood," he said, and the word carried no defensiveness, no attempt to negotiate, only alignment with the reality that had been established. Malcolm nodded once, a small, precise motion that acknowledged the response, not as agreement, but as completion of the step, and then his gaze shifted briefly across the showroom, taking in the space one more time, not as a visitor, not as an observer, but as someone who had built it, defined it, and now reinforced what it was meant to represent. The lights continued to reflect across the glass, the room unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally different in meaning, and in that quiet, controlled space, where no voice had been raised and no movement had been rushed, the system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had revealed, it had recorded, and now it had acted. The room did not return to what it had been before. It could not, because something fundamental had been revealed and reset, and now every surface, every reflection, every quiet corner of the showroom carried that shift in a way that could not be undone. Malcolm Hayes stood with the same calm presence. But now that presence was no longer a question. It was the standard itself, anchored, visible, and fully understood by everyone in the space. Ryan Caldwell had stepped slightly back from the counter, not instructed to, not forced to, but naturally, as if his position had already adjusted to match the new reality, his posture no longer defining the room, but aligning within it. The overhead lights continued their soft glow across polished marble and glass, but now the environment felt different, not because it had changed, but because the way it was being experienced had shifted entirely. Lily Tran remained behind the counter, her hands now resting lightly on the surface, her posture grounded, her expression composed but thoughtful, because what she had witnessed was not just a moment of correction. It was a demonstration of what leadership looked like when it was rooted in clarity instead of assumption. The couple nearby had not moved, but their presence had changed, no longer passive observers, but participants in a moment that had extended beyond their own purpose for being there. The woman's eyes steady, reflective, the man beside her standing with a quiet awareness that something significant had just taken place. Malcolm took a slow breath, then shifted his attention fully toward the space itself, not as a visitor, not as an outsider, but as someone reclaiming alignment within something he had built. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority, but now with direction that extended beyond the immediate situation. "We do not pause operations," he said, his tone even, controlled, but clear. "We elevate them." And the words did not sound like instruction alone. They sounded like principle, something that defined how the space would move forward from this moment. Lily felt that immediately, the shift from correction to continuation, from resolving what had gone wrong to reinforcing what should always be right, and she straightened slightly, her attention sharpening, ready without needing to be told. Malcolm's gaze moved briefly to her, then back across the showroom. "Customer experience does not stop because we made a mistake," he continued. "It improves because we recognized it." And the clarity of that statement settled into the room with a quiet strength, redefining the moment not as disruption, but as refinement. The couple exchanged another glance, the woman's expression softening slightly, the man giving a small nod, both of them understanding that what they were witnessing was not a breakdown, but a realignment. Ryan stood quietly, listening, his posture steady, his presence no longer central, but still present, still engaged, still part of the process that was now moving forward without him at the center of it. Malcolm stepped slightly to the side, not dramatically, not to create distance, but to shift the flow of the room. His movement subtle but intentional, creating space for the next action to take place. "Lily," he said, his voice calm, but directed, and she responded immediately, not out of urgency, but out of readiness, stepping forward with a composed, professional presence that matched the tone of the room. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, her posture aligned with the clarity that had been established. Malcolm looked at her for a moment, not evaluating, not testing, but acknowledging. Resume service, he said, and ensure every guest is assisted without delay. And the instruction was simple, but it carried the full weight of everything that had just been addressed, because now it was not just about action, it was about intention behind that action. Lily nodded once, firm and confident. Understood, she replied, and in that moment, her role shifted, not formally, not announced, but clearly, because she stepped into the space with a level of awareness that had been demonstrated and now needed to be carried forward. She turned toward the couple, her expression warm, professional, but genuine. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "How can I assist you today?" And the words, simple and expected, now carried a different meaning, not routine, but intentional, not automatic, but conscious. The woman smiled slightly, her posture easing. "We were looking at the watches," she said, and the conversation resumed, not as if nothing had happened, but as if something had been improved. Malcolm observed this quietly, his gaze steady, his presence still anchoring the room, but no longer needing to direct every movement, because the standard had been set and now it was being carried. Ryan remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his gaze moving briefly toward the interaction now unfolding. And in that glance, there was no resistance, no tension, only acknowledgement of the space continuing without him in the role he had previously held. Malcolm turned his attention back to him for a brief moment, not to revisit what had already been decided, but to acknowledge the transition. And in that brief exchange of eye contact, everything that needed to be said had already been said. The showroom continued, not louder, not faster, but clearer, each movement now aligned with the principle that had just been reinforced, and in that alignment, the space felt stronger, not because it had avoided a problem, but because it had addressed one directly. Malcolm took one final look across the room, not searching, not questioning, but confirming. And in that quiet confirmation, there was a sense of completion, not of the story, but of the correction, the kind that does not erase what happened, but ensures it does not repeat. The lights continued to reflect across glass and marble, the environment unchanged, but the meaning of it now fully restored. And in that still, controlled space, where every word had been measured and every action deliberate, the true standard of the store stood clearly, not written, not announced, but lived. The showroom moved again, not in chaos, not in noise, but in rhythm, a quiet, controlled rhythm that felt stronger than before, as if every step, every glance, every word now carried intention instead of assumption. And Malcolm Hayes stood at the center of it without needing to be the focus. His presence no longer questioned, no longer tested, but fully understood as the foundation the space itself rested on. Lily Tran guided the couple through the watch display with steady confidence, her tone warm but precise, her movements deliberate, every interaction reflecting the standard that had just been reinforced, not as performance, but as practice, and the couple responded in kind, their posture relaxed now, their attention engaged, their experience no longer shaped by uncertainty, but by clarity. Ryan Caldwell remained near the counter, no longer behind it, no longer defining it, but still present within the space, his posture grounded, his gaze occasionally moving across the showroom. Not to monitor, not to control, but to observe, to understand, to see the environment not as something he directed, but as something he had been responsible for shaping. And in that shift, there was no resistance left, only awareness, quiet and complete. Malcolm took a slow step forward, not toward anyone in particular, but into the space itself, his eyes moving across the displays, the staff, the customers, the structure he had built now functioning as it was meant to. And in that observation, there was no need for correction, no need for adjustment, because the standard had already been restored, not through force, but through clarity. He paused briefly near the glass case where the diamond ring still rested, untouched since he had placed it back, the light catching its surface in the same precise way it had earlier. But now the meaning of that moment had shifted entirely, no longer a point of denial, but a point of definition, a reminder of what had been revealed and what had been corrected. Malcolm's reflection appeared faintly in the glass, layered over the diamonds beneath it, and for a brief second, the image held, not as symbolism, but as alignment. the man and the space no longer separate, but fully connected. Behind him, Lily completed the interaction with the couple, her tone steady, her posture professional, and as she finalized their selection, the woman smiled, a small, genuine expression that carried appreciation not just for the service, but for the experience itself. "Thank you," she said, and Lily nodded. Of course, her response simple, but grounded in the standards she now carried forward. The man beside her glanced briefly toward Malcolm, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of what he had witnessed, and he gave a small nod before turning back to the transaction. Malcolm noticed it, not directly, not in a way that drew attention, but enough to register, and he returned the nod just as subtly, because recognition did not need to be announced, it only needed to exist. The room continued in this quiet flow, each interaction now aligned, each movement intentional, and the contrast between what had been and what now was did not need to be explained. It was visible in every detail. Ryan shifted his stance slightly, stepping away from the counter entirely now, his position no longer tied to it, his role already transitioning into something else, something that would be defined beyond this moment. And for a brief second, his gaze met Malcolm's again, not with uncertainty, not with tension, but with clarity, and in that look, there was no need for words, because everything had already been addressed. Malcolm gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement, a recognition of the shift that had taken place. And with that, the final thread of the moment settled into place. He turned slightly, his attention moving toward the entrance of the showroom, the glass doors reflecting the city outside, the movement of people, the flow of life beyond the controlled environment within, and for a moment, he stood there, not as someone leaving, but as someone confirming that what was inside now matched what it was meant to represent outside. The light from the street filtered in softly, blending with the interior glow, and in that overlap, the space felt complete, not perfect, but aligned, and that alignment was what mattered. Malcolm took a step toward the door, his movement unhurried, his presence still carrying the quiet authority that had shaped the entire moment. And as he reached the threshold, he paused for just a second, not to look back, not to check, but to let the space stand on its own, because now it could. Now it no longer needed correction, only consistency. Behind him, the showroom continued, Lily assisting another guest, the couple completing their purchase, the atmosphere steady, professional, and clear, and Ryan standing within it, no longer as the one who defined it, but as someone who had learned what it required. Malcolm stepped through the doors, the city air meeting him as he moved outside, the sounds of traffic and distant conversation blending into the background. And he did not rush, did not look back, because the moment did not need revisiting. It had already done what it was meant to do. Inside, the lights continued to reflect across glass and marble, the diamonds catching every angle of movement. But now those reflections carried something more than value. They carried meaning, a standard that had been tested, revealed, and restored. And in that quiet continuation, without announcement, without spectacle, the truth remained exactly where it had been placed, steady, visible, and unshakable, proving without a single raised voice that respect is not something you assign based on what you think you see. It is something you give before you decide what someone is worth, and in that difference, everything changes.